Imagine a man whose mind was sharper than anyone around him, a man who could see what others missed, notice details that escaped even the most experienced eyes, and solve mysteries that left the local sheriff scratching his head in frustration. But here's the shocking part. This man was a slave. Yes, a person who was considered property, whose life and abilities were dismissed by society, quietly solving crimes that no one else could. And yet, despite his brilliance, despite the countless lives he may have saved, the newspapers of the time never dared to mention his name. Not once. Now stop for a moment and ask yourself, how does someone so indispensable vanish from history? How does someone whose mind was a weapon, whose intelligence was unmatched, remain invisible to the world? That is the story we are about to uncover. Today you will learn about a figure who operated in the shadows, whose genius was recognized only in whispers, and whose contributions were deliberately erased from the public record. This is not just a tale of injustice, it is a lesson in the power of hidden brilliance, a reminder that the greatest minds are not always the ones whose names are remembered. In this video, we will take you back in time, to an era where talent and courage were not enough to guarantee recognition. You will see how this man, forced into a life of oppression, became the problem solver for a sheriff who desperately needed him. He was the silent force behind solved crimes, the unseen hand that restored order, and the invisible hero that history refused to acknowledge. Yet, behind every solved mystery, behind every breakthrough in the investigation, his presence loomed large, even if the world refused to see it. We will explore the ways in which his intelligence outshone societal expectations, how he used observation, deduction, and intuition to unravel complex cases, and why his contributions were deliberately hidden from public view. This is a story that challenges the way we think about recognition, history, and justice. It is a story that asks a deeper question: how many other unsung heroes like him have been erased from history, simply because the world was not ready to give them credit? By the end of this video, you will not only understand the incredible feats of this slave who solved crimes that baffled the sheriff, but you will also feel the weight of a truth too often ignored, that brilliance, courage, and ingenuity do not always guarantee acknowledgement, especially in a world built on inequality. And you may find yourself inspired, compelled to look beyond the surface, to question whose stories are being told, and whose are being silenced. So stay with us, because the story you are about to hear will surprise you, shock you, and ultimately, remind you that heroes exist even where history refuses to name them. This is a tale of intellect, courage, and injustice, a story that deserves to be remembered. Before we talk about the man who solved crimes no one else could, we need to understand the world he lived in. This was a time when slavery was legal across much of America, a time when people were judged not by their mind or character, but by the color of their skin. The laws of the land treated African Americans as property, denying them basic rights, freedom, and recognition. They were bought and sold like objects, yet many of them possessed intelligence, creativity, and skills that could rival anyone in society. Despite this, the world around them refused to acknowledge it. Before we talk about the extraordinary abilities of this man, it's important to see the social conditions that shaped his life. Life for African Americans was harsh and unforgiving. Every aspect of daily life was controlled, from where they could go to what they could say. Education was often forbidden, opportunities to demonstrate skill or intelligence were rare, and any achievements were usually credited to someone else or ignored entirely. Society was built on a hierarchy that placed white people at the top, and anyone with darker skin was expected to remain invisible, no matter how capable they were. Before we talk about how this man became indispensable to the sheriff, consider the racial attitudes of the time. Prejudice was so deeply ingrained that people assumed African Americans were incapable of complex thought or problem solving. Even when confronted with proof to the contrary, society often refused to accept it. Newspapers, public records, and official documents routinely left out the names and accomplishments of black people, erasing them from history as if they never existed. Talent and brilliance were not enough to overcome the walls built by racism. Before we talk about the specific cases he solved, it's worth noting that many African Americans in that era were quietly extraordinary. They built communities, invented tools, healed the sick, and solved problems that others could not. Yet, because of the color of their skin, their stories rarely survived. Schools, churches, and newspapers often omitted them. Local leaders might rely on their skill in secret, but the world outside remained blind to their contributions. Recognition, respect and public acknowledgement were almost always reserved for white individuals, no matter who truly deserved it. Before we talk about his personal journey, imagine living in such a world. Imagine having the sharpest mind in your town, yet being forced to remain in the shadows. Every act of intelligence, every solution, every breakthrough had to be hidden or quietly credited to someone else. Even the simplest acknowledgement could be dangerous or denied. The system was designed to suppress, erase and minimize the impact of anyone who did not fit the narrow mold of privilege. In this environment, the man we are about to learn about performed feats that were remarkable not just for their skill, but for the courage it took to exercise his brilliance at all. Before we talk about how he came to work with the sheriff, we need to recognize the invisible chains around him. The world of that time demanded obedience, silence, and invisibility from African Americans, no matter their talent. And yet, some of them, like him, found ways to stand out, to make a difference, and to solve problems that others could not. The story of his life cannot be understood without knowing the world that tried so hard to erase him. Before we talk about the incredible impact he would have on solving crimes, we need to understand who he was. Born into a life he did not choose, he lived in a small town in the American South, where slavery shaped every aspect of daily life. His world was one of strict rules, long hours of labor, and limited freedom. Yet, even within these confines, he displayed an extraordinary mind. He noticed things that others overlooked, connected pieces of information that seemed unrelated, and approached problems with a clarity that often surprised those around him. Before we talk about the cases he would solve, it is important to see how he came to the attention of the local sheriff. While performing his daily tasks, he often observed the world around him with careful attention. He noticed patterns in people's behavior, inconsistencies in stories, and details that others dismissed as unimportant. His intelligence was quiet but unmistakable. Eventually, the sheriff began to recognize that there was something exceptional about him, something that could not be ignored, even within the rigid structures of a society that refused to acknowledge the talent of African Americans. Before we talk about the first time he truly made a difference, we need to understand his skills. He had an uncanny ability to observe without being seen, to notice what others missed, and to think several steps ahead. His mind worked like a puzzle master, able to take fragments of information and assemble them into a complete picture. This skill was paired with extraordinary reasoning and problem-solving abilities. Even complex crimes, which left the sheriff puzzled and frustrated, could be untangled through his insights. His solutions were often so precise and accurate that it seemed as though he could see into the heart of the mystery itself. Before we talk about how he became indispensable, consider his adaptability. He could read people, understanding their motives and intentions almost instinctively. He knew how to question witnesses, how to gather information quietly, and how to make deductions that others could not see. These were not just natural gifts, they were honed skills, developed through observation, practice, and necessity. Every day, living under the watchful eyes of owners and the restrictions of slavery, he learned to think strategically, to plan ahead, and to act carefully. These abilities would become invaluable when crime struck in his town. Before we talk about his first major success, it is also important to see the paradox of his life. Here was a man whose mind was sharper than many in positions of authority, yet the society around him refused to acknowledge his worth. He was treated as property, yet he possessed the kind of intelligence that could solve cases no one else could. This duality shaped him, forcing him to operate with both caution and courage. He had to make every move carefully, offering his brilliance where it could help, while remaining invisible to the world that would never fully accept him. Before we talk about the stories of the crimes he would solve, it is clear that his life was defined by skill, intelligence and observation. He was a man ahead of his time, working quietly in the shadows, using his gifts not for recognition, but for results. His mind, sharp and precise, became a tool that no one could match, and it was this extraordinary combination of talents that would bring him into the sheriff's confidence, and eventually into history, though history itself would refuse to name him. Before we talk about the first crime he solved, we need to understand the kind of challenges the sheriff faced. The town was small, but crime was not uncommon. Burglars struck homes at night, valuables disappeared, and sometimes worse crimes threatened the safety of families. Local authorities often struggled to find clues or connect the dots, leaving the community anxious and fearful. Many cases were dismissed as unsolvable, and the sheriff was frustrated by the limits of his own knowledge and resources. Before we talk about how he became involved, it is clear that he had a mind uniquely suited to this work. He noticed patterns in behavior that others overlooked, remembered small details that no one else thought important, and pieced together events in a logical order that revealed the truth. One night, a wealthy merchant's store was robbed, and the sheriff could not find a single lead. It was this man who quietly observed footprints in the mud, the placement of a broken lock, and even subtle hints in the merchant's description of the thief. From these small details, he deduced not only who had committed the crime, but also where the stolen items could be recovered. Before we talk about another case, consider his bravery. Solving crimes was not just a mental challenge, it was often dangerous. In one incident, a violent dispute had left a man missing, and townspeople feared the worst. While others hesitated, he carefully examined the evidence, asked the right questions, and went to places others would not dare to go. His courage, combined with his intelligence, allowed him to locate the missing man safely and reveal the truth behind the crime. Without him, the situation might have ended in panic, false accusations, or worse. Before we talk about how he gained the sheriff's trust, it's important to note his cleverness. He often set traps with words and questions, prompting suspects to reveal information without realizing it. In one particularly complex theft, he noticed contradictions in a neighbor's story that everyone else missed. By observing body language, tone, and timing, he was able to identify the real culprit. The sheriff, though amazed, knew better than to doubt him. Many cases that had previously gone cold were suddenly solved, thanks to the sharp insight of this man who was officially invisible to the public. Before we talk about the scope of his contributions, imagine how many mysteries went unsolved before his involvement. Families who had lost valuables, townspeople living in fear, and law enforcement struggling without leads. All of this changed because of him. He had a way of seeing connections where others saw only confusion, understanding motives where others saw chaos, and predicting outcomes that seemed impossible. Each success increased the sheriff's reliance on him, and yet outside the walls of the office, no one could give him the credit he deserved. Before we talk about the larger impact of his work, it is clear that his contributions were extraordinary. His intelligence, courage, and observational skills made him indispensable. Cases that baffled experienced officers, incidents that would have remained mysteries, and situations that threatened the community's safety, all were solved because of him. And while the world refused to recognize his efforts, his actions quietly shaped the course of justice in that town, proving that brilliance does not need acknowledgement to be powerful. Before we talk about how the sheriff came to depend on him, it is important to understand the unusual relationship that developed between them. The sheriff was an experienced man, respected by the community, and tasked with maintaining order in a town where law and justice were constantly tested. Yet even his experience had limits. Crimes were becoming more complex, suspects more cunning, and leads often vanished without a trace. It was in these moments of frustration and urgency that he realized he needed someone with a mind unlike any he had encountered, a mind that could see patterns, read people, and uncover truths that remained invisible to everyone else. Before we talk about specific instances of reliance, it's clear that this man became the sheriff's secret weapon. While society refused to acknowledge his skill, the sheriff quietly leaned on him for guidance, insight, and solutions. No case was too difficult for them to tackle together. In private, the sheriff would seek his advice, trust his judgment, and act on his deductions. The community saw only the sheriff taking action, unaware that behind every solved crime was the brilliance of a man whose name would never appear in print. He was both indispensable and invisible, a paradox that defined their working relationship. Before we talk about the dangers this reliance posed, consider the way their partnership functioned. The sheriff might have been the one in uniform, holding authority in public, but it was this man who solved the puzzles, pointed out overlooked clues, and provided the insight necessary for justice. The sheriff relied on his intelligence in ways that went beyond simple guidance. He relied on him to prevent mistakes, to protect the innocent, and to uncover the truth where no one else could. And yet outside of their private interactions, no one could recognize his contributions without facing the harsh prejudices of the time. Before we talk about how this paradox shaped his life, it's important to see the tension it created. Here was a man whose talent the sheriff needed desperately, yet society's rules refused to acknowledge it. Official records, newspapers, and public accounts credited only the sheriff, giving the appearance that he alone solved the crimes. The paradox was stark. The sheriff could not succeed without him, but the world would never give him the recognition he deserved. He was simultaneously the key to justice, and a ghost in history, his intellect acknowledged only in whispered confidences. Before we talk about how this dynamic evolved, consider the emotional and psychological weight of it. To be so essential, yet so invisible, required both patience and resilience. He had to perform flawlessly, yet accept that no public acclaim would ever come. He had to save lives, solve crimes, and bring order, all while knowing that society would refuse to name him. And still, he continued to serve, driven not by recognition, but by a sense of duty, skill, and perhaps a quiet defiance against the injustice that sought to erase him. Before we talk about the broader impact of their collaboration, it is clear that the sheriff's reliance on him illustrates both brilliance and injustice. One man held the key to solving mysteries, protecting the town, and delivering justice, yet the world remained blind to his contributions. Their partnership shows the paradox of power and invisibility, of talent and erasure. Without him, many cases would have gone cold. Without the sheriff's trust, his brilliance might never have been applied. Together, they solved what no one else could, even as history refused to acknowledge one of them. Before we talk about the newspapers, we need to understand the world they operated in. During this time, society was rigidly divided by race, and the media reflected that hierarchy. Newspapers were not simply reporting facts, they were shaping public perception. The voices, achievements and contributions of African Americans were routinely ignored or erased. Even when a black person's skill or intelligence was undeniable, the social rules of the era dictated that credit be given only to white figures. To name a slave as the solver of crimes would have challenged the social order, undermining the carefully constructed narrative that only white men held authority and expertise. Before we talk about specific examples of erasure, it is important to see how racism influenced every decision about what appeared in print. Editors and journalists often assumed their audience would reject or be outraged by the idea that a black man could outperform a white official. The newspapers were both a reflection and reinforcement of social prejudice. By refusing to mention his name, they maintained the illusion that justice and problem-solving were the exclusive domain of white men. At the same time, they preserved the hierarchy that kept African Americans invisible, even when their contributions were critical. Before we talk about how this contrast affected the town, consider the paradox. The man who solved crimes the sheriff could not was simultaneously invisible in the public eye. Every solved case, every restored order, every breakthrough in investigation had his fingerprints on it, but the headlines and records gave credit elsewhere. The sheriff's successes were celebrated, while the true mind behind them remained a ghost. The very act of erasing him from newspapers reinforced the message that African Americans, no matter how brilliant, were to be hidden from public recognition. Before we talk about the social consequences, it's important to understand the subtle ways in which newspapers perpetuated this erasure. Even in reports that described the solutions to crimes, the accounts were carefully worded to avoid acknowledging him. They would praise the sheriff, commend the town, or highlight anonymous help, but they never identified the true source of the insights. This deliberate omission created a false history, one that excluded him entirely, while maintaining the credibility of the social hierarchy. His intelligence was known privately, but it never entered the official record. Before we talk about the psychological weight of this, consider the broader message it sent. Newspapers were one of the few ways information traveled beyond the town. By refusing to mention his name, they ensured that the story of his skill and courage remained local, private, and almost mythic. To the wider world, it was as if he had never existed. And yet within the sheriff's office, and among those who witnessed his work, his importance was unquestioned. The contrast between his hidden genius and the public erasure of his name was stark, a constant reminder of the injustice of the era. Before we talk about the deeper implications of this erasure, it is clear that newspapers were not just failing to credit him, they were actively participating in the maintenance of racial hierarchy. His brilliance threatened the narrative society wanted to preserve. By keeping him invisible, they reinforced the idea that recognition and authority belonged only to white men, even while depending on the intellect and courage of someone they refused to name. The world celebrated results without acknowledging the mind that created them, and this contradiction defines both his story and the bitter reality of history. Before we talk about the wider impact of his work, it's important to understand the community he served. The town relied heavily on the sheriff to maintain order, to keep families safe, and to solve the crimes that disrupted daily life. Without effective law enforcement, fear and uncertainty could take hold. Yet the sheriff alone could only do so much. It was the quiet genius of this man, working behind the scenes, that transformed the way justice was delivered. Cases that would have remained cold were solved, and the town began to feel a sense of security that had previously been missing. Before we talk about specific examples, consider how his influence extended far beyond solving individual crimes. He had a way of noticing connections that others missed, spotting motives hidden in plain sight, and understanding human behavior with remarkable clarity. When a merchant's goods went missing, or when arguments between neighbors escalated into threats, it was his insight that allowed the sheriff to act decisively. Families who had been on edge for weeks found relief. Innocent people avoided false accusations. The town slowly began to recognize, in quiet ways, that order and fairness were being restored, but they never knew who to thank. Before we talk about another instance, it is worth noting that his contributions were often subtle yet profound. A pattern of petty thefts, for example, might have gone unnoticed until it became a serious problem. By carefully observing the community, identifying inconsistencies, and anticipating the actions of those involved, he prevented future crimes before they escalated. His skill in piecing together seemingly unrelated events allowed the sheriff to act quickly and efficiently, saving time, resources, and sometimes even lives. The ripple effect of his work strengthened not just the law but the very trust people had in the justice system. Before we talk about the social implications, consider the anecdotal evidence of his influence. Townspeople would often remark, sometimes in hushed tones, that the sheriff always seemed to know more than he should, that mysteries were solved with almost impossible speed. No one knew the source of this insight. The clerk who kept records, the neighbors who witnessed arrests, even the victims themselves, sensed that something extraordinary was at play. They could see results, they could feel the impact, but the man behind them remained invisible. His intellect guided the sheriff's decisions, yet his name never appeared in conversation outside the office. Before we talk about the broader legal implications, it's clear that his work shaped the way justice operated in that community. His observations and problem-solving abilities prevented miscarriages of justice. Crimes were solved accurately, efficiently, and fairly. The sheriff's authority was strengthened, but more importantly, the people benefited. Lives were protected, property was recovered, and confidence in law enforcement increased. Yet the remarkable mind responsible for this transformation remained uncredited and unseen, a silent force keeping the town safe. Before we talk about the next chapter in his story, it is evident that the community and the justice system were deeply influenced by his unseen hand. The very fabric of law and order was strengthened by someone who could not be publicly acknowledged. His impact was undeniable, yet paradoxically hidden. The town thrived under his guidance, even as history refused to record his name, demonstrating how one person's brilliance can quietly change the course of a community's life. Before we talk about closing this story, take a moment to reflect. How many others like him were erased from history? How many brilliant minds, courageous hearts, and extraordinary talents quietly shaped their communities, yet never had their names written in newspapers or remembered in records? His story forces us to ask difficult questions. Who deserves recognition? Who decides what history remembers? And how many truths have been hidden simply because society refused to see them? As we think about these questions, let his life remind us that justice is more than laws, talent is more than fame, and memory is more than written words. True impact can happen quietly, yet still change the world in profound ways. By remembering him, we honor all the unsung heroes whose contributions shaped the lives of those around them, even when the world looked the other way. If this story moved you, made you think, or inspired you to look deeper into history, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Join us as we uncover the hidden stories, the invisible heroes, and the lessons that history tries to forget. Your support helps us bring more of these untold stories to light.